Black doctor saves a racist white woman's life. When she wakes up, she is mad. The hospital's emergency room was bustling with activity as doctors and nurses raced against time. A sharp beep echoed through the room, signaling another urgent case. Dr. Elijah Matthews, a well-respected black doctor in his late 30s, was right in the thick of it. His mind was sharp, honed by years of experience in high-stress situations. He moved swiftly, coordinating with his team of nurses and fellow doctors, ensuring that every decision was made with precision. But in the back of his mind there was always one thought that pushed him forward: saving lives. It was just another chaotic evening when Anne, a middle-aged white woman with an air of arrogance, was wheeled into the ER. She had been involved in a severe car accident and her injuries were serious. The paramedics had done their best, but there was no time to waste. Anne was in critical condition, her pulse weak and her breathing shallow. The emergency room was crowded, but Dr. Matthews had a way of commanding the room without raising his voice. He immediately took charge, giving quick instructions to his team. But as he approached Anne's bed, something stopped him. He could hear her voice even though she was barely conscious. It wasn't the usual groans of someone in pain, it was sharp, filled with anger. "Get me a white doctor." Anne's voice cracked as she struggled to breathe, her words laced with disgust. "I don't want anyone else. I want a white doctor." Dr. Matthews paused for a split second, his brow furrowing. It wasn't the first time he had encountered this kind of prejudice in his career, but today, in this moment, he had to remain focused. This wasn't about him. It was about Anne's life. He didn't have the luxury of being offended. Anne's pulse was slipping and every second counted. "Anne, I'm Dr. Matthews and I'm going to take care of you now. We need to act fast," he said, his voice calm and steady. Anne's eyes widened slightly as she turned her head to face him. She took in his features, processing the fact that the doctor she had just cursed was, in fact, the very person who was now standing between her and death. Her lips parted, but the anger didn't fade. "I don't want you. I want a doctor who looks like me." She spat, her breath ragged. Dr. Matthews didn't react to the venom in her words. He gave her a small, reassuring nod before focusing on the task at hand. His professionalism was unshaken. He knew what needed to be done, and he wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Anne, distract him from saving her life. As he moved into action, the other medical staff worked around him. He led them through the necessary steps to stabilize her, making critical decisions that would determine whether she would survive the night. He ordered the nurses to administer pain relief and antibiotics, preparing her for surgery. Through it all, Anne continued to mumble in protest, her weak voice barely audible. But Dr. Matthews didn't let it deter him. He knew that her anger wasn't personal. It was a product of her upbringing, her experiences, and her own fears. But none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was keeping her alive. The next few minutes felt like hours as the team worked tirelessly. Dr. Matthews carefully examined Anne's injuries, his mind calculating the best course of action. A fractured rib had punctured her lung and she was bleeding internally. The chances of survival were slim if she didn't receive immediate surgery. He made the call. The team swiftly moved Anne to the operating room and Dr. Matthews scrubbed in. As he prepared for the surgery, his thoughts were focused solely on Anne's well-being. In his mind, there was no room for anything else. His hands were steady as he began the procedure. The sound of his scalpel cutting through flesh was the only noise in the otherwise silent room. Despite the chaos, Dr. Matthews remained calm. Every stitch, every incision was precise, a reflection of the years he had spent perfecting his craft. His team followed his lead, working in seamless coordination, all with one goal in mind: saving Anne's life. As the surgery progressed, Anne's condition stabilized. Her heart rate began to even out, and the blood flow returned to normal. Dr. Matthews worked efficiently, making sure to address every issue, no matter how small. By the time the surgery was over, Anne was no longer on the brink of death. She was stable, and the threat to her life had passed. Dr. Matthews stood over her unconscious form, a sense of relief washing over him. He hadn't just saved her life. He had done it in the face of prejudice and hatred. He had done it for the simple reason that it was his job, his duty to save people, no matter who they were or what they believed. As he left the operating room, he couldn't help but think about Anne's words. She had refused to be treated by him solely because of the color of his skin. And yet, it was his hands that had brought her back from the edge of death. Despite her racist outbursts, Dr. Matthews held no ill will toward her. He understood that hatred often came from a place of ignorance, fear, and insecurity. People who were afraid of change, who feared the unknown, often lashed out in the most hurtful ways. But Dr. Matthews knew that his job wasn't just about fixing bodies, it was about healing hearts too. As he made his way to his office, Dr. Matthews reflected on the situation. He had no illusions that Anne would thank him. In fact, he suspected that when she woke up, she would be just as angry as she had been before. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that he had done what he had set out to do. He had saved a life. And that, in itself, was enough. Anne's body lay still on the hospital bed, surrounded by the soft hum of machines and the occasional beeping of her vital signs. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of fresh linens. Dr. Matthews had done his job, but the hardest part was yet to come. The hardest part was not saving her life. It was the aftermath. As Anne remained unconscious, her mind fought to stay in the realm of dreams and darkness, away from the chaos of the world she had been thrust into. She was in no state to understand that the very person she had rejected, the one whose hands had pulled her back from the brink of death, was a man whose mere existence she had condemned with words. In that moment, her body was alive, but her mind was trapped, lingering between anger and confusion. The world outside the confines of her hospital room carried on, oblivious to the profound shift that had just occurred. Dr. Matthews, however, was not oblivious. As he left the operating room, having seen to the critical aspects of Anne's recovery, his thoughts swirled. There had been no time for personal reflection while he was operating, but now that the immediate danger had passed, the weight of her words began to settle into his mind. "I want a white doctor," she had said. The words stung, but he couldn't afford to let them linger, not when his role had been so clear. His duty was to heal, not to be offended. Dr. Matthews had encountered this kind of prejudice before. It was something he had grown accustomed to over the years, but it still cut deep. His patients had always come from a diverse range of backgrounds, yet there were still those who held tight to outdated beliefs. People who believed their own skin color made them more deserving of care. People who saw the world through the lens of division. Anne's words, though hurtful, were not new to him. What hurt, though, was that they came from someone whose life he had just saved. He knew that this wasn't personal. It was never about him. It was about fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of change, fear of being less than in a world that was constantly shifting. Anne's anger, as harsh and misplaced as it was a reflection of her own insecurities and a world that had taught her to view others through the narrow lens of race. And yet, as Dr. Matthews sat in the quiet of his office, his mind replayed the events of the day. His job wasn't just about fixing broken bodies. It was about healing a fractured world, one life at a time. But Anne's reaction was a reminder that some people would never see the world through the lens of compassion, at least not without a fight. It was a humbling thought, one that weighed heavily on his heart. As the hours passed, Anne's condition improved. Her breathing became more steady, and the faint beep of the monitors signaled that she was slowly stabilizing. Dr. Matthews checked on her every hour, making sure she had the best care possible. But even as he ensured her recovery, a part of him knew that this was just the beginning. When Anne finally began to stir, it wasn't with the soft awakening of someone who had peacefully drifted into rest. It was with the tension of someone pulled unwillingly from the depths of their own consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she seemed disoriented, unsure of where she was. The sterile white walls of the hospital room came into focus, and the soft beep of the machines became louder in her ears. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy, sluggish, as though it didn't belong to her. It wasn't the pain that made Anne angry. It was the realization of who had saved her. As the haze cleared from her mind, her first thoughts weren't of gratitude or relief. Instead, they were of fury. Fury at herself for needing help, and fury at the fact that the person who had given her that help was someone she had deemed unworthy of doing so. She could feel the tightness in her chest, a mix of pain and stubbornness. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the care. The doctors and nurses had been attentive and the surgery had been successful. But Anne's pride, her deep-rooted beliefs, made it impossible for her to accept the idea that a black man had just saved her life. As Anne slowly came to her senses, the anger boiled over. She was barely able to sit up, but she managed to push herself upright, glaring at the medical staff who had been quietly monitoring her condition. Her voice was hoarse, but it was loud enough to demand attention. "I want a white doctor now," she shouted, her voice thick with resentment. The nurses exchanged uncomfortable glances, but they had been through this before. Anne's words were not new to them. They had seen patients, usually in less critical situations, express similar sentiments. But this was different. This wasn't just about a preference for a doctor. This was about something much deeper, something that made the entire room feel heavy with the weight of history. One of the nurses, a young woman named Maria, stepped forward. She had worked with Dr. Matthews for years and had seen firsthand the kind of person he was. Not just as a doctor, but as a human being. She had heard Anne's outburst, but she wasn't going to let it stand unchallenged. "Ma'am, Dr. Matthews saved your life. He's one of the best doctors here, and you're going to be fine because of him," Maria said, her tone firm but respectful. Anne shot her a venomous look. "I don't care who saved me. I don't want a black doctor." The word stung, and for a moment Maria was taken aback. But she remained calm, knowing that she needed to diffuse the situation, not escalate it. "I understand that you're upset, but we're here to take care of you. Dr. Matthews did his job, and he did it well," Maria continued, trying to steer the conversation back toward Anne's recovery. But Anne wasn't ready to listen. Her mind was clouded with hatred and shame, two emotions that made it difficult for her to see beyond her own prejudices. As the days passed, Anne's condition slowly improved, but her attitude toward Dr. Matthews didn't change. She refused to acknowledge him, and every time he entered the room to check on her, her anger flared up again. But Dr. Matthews wasn't fazed. He knew that the healing process wasn't just about physical recovery. It was about emotional and psychological recovery as well. He didn't expect Anne to suddenly change her views, but he had a responsibility to do more than just treat her body. He had to try, at least, to help her understand that there was more to life than the small, bitter box of hatred she had chosen to live in. As Anne's condition began to stabilize, the nurses and doctors could see the shift in her behavior. The anger was still there, but there was something else too. A sense of confusion, as if she were starting to question everything she had known about herself and the world around her. In her quiet moments, when no one was watching, Anne began to wonder how it was possible for someone like Dr. Matthews, someone she had once deemed beneath her, to have so much power. Power to save her life, power to change her fate. Was it really about race, or was it something more profound, something she hadn't yet been able to comprehend? Her recovery wasn't just physical. It was, in its own way, beginning to crack open her rigid worldview. The days in the hospital passed slowly for Anne. Each day was a little better than the last, her body healing, her wounds closing, and her pulse growing steadier. But even as her physical condition improved, something in her mind remained clouded. It wasn't the pain that lingered, it was something much deeper, something far harder to confront. Anne knew that her anger had not abated. It still burned in her chest every time Dr. Matthews walked into her room. But as much as she tried to ignore it, there was a gnawing feeling inside of her, something uncomfortable that wouldn't let her rest. She had been raised to believe in certain things that had shaped her entire life. But now, in this sterile hospital room, lying in a bed that was far too small to contain the pride and prejudice she had carried for so many years, Anne began to realize something. The world was not as simple as she had once believed. She had spent most of her life within the safe confines of her own biases, her own ideas of what was right and wrong. Her world had been neatly divided into the people who were like her and the people who weren't. She had never questioned this view, never dared to think beyond the narrow borders of what she had been taught. But now everything felt different. Her body had been broken, shattered, and brought back to life by a man she had once despised before even knowing him. Dr. Matthews had not saved her because of her race, had not cared about her opinions, her beliefs, or her history. He had saved her because it was his job, because he was a doctor and it was his duty to heal. He had acted without hesitation, without concern for her views, and it struck Anne in a way that words couldn't describe. He had been kind to her even in the face of her anger. He had been patient when she had been rude, understanding when she had been cruel, and yet she couldn't accept it. She couldn't let go of her pride. Every time he came to check on her, she looked away, She didn't want to meet his eyes, didn't want to acknowledge the humanity in his gaze. To her, doing so would be an admission that she was wrong. But as each hour passed, it became harder to ignore the truth that was staring her in the face. The very person she had rejected, the person she had cursed for something as trivial as skin color, was the person who had given her life back. Anne lay in her bed one evening, staring at the ceiling, her mind a whirl of confusion. The hospital was quiet, the usual hum of activity outside her room a distant echo. She heard the soft click of the door opening, and she knew it was Dr. Matthews before he even spoke. His presence was always calming, even when she resisted it. His footsteps were measured, his voice steady, as if he carried the weight of the world but never let it show. This time, however, something was different. He wasn't just there to check her vitals. This time he was there for something more. He walked over to her side, his gaze soft but unwavering. "How are you feeling today, Anne?" His voice was gentle, but there was a firmness to it, a quiet strength that made it impossible to ignore. Anne shifted in the bed, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. She didn't want to respond, didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing she was still struggling with the thoughts swirling in her head. But his presence had a way of making her feel exposed, like her walls were crumbling brick by brick. She opened her mouth, ready to offer a sharp reply, but something caught in her throat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Dr. Matthews waited, as he always did, with a patience that seemed boundless. Anne's anger, the anger that had consumed her for so long, was still there, lurking beneath the surface. But now it wasn't as easy to tap into. It didn't feel as justified anymore. What could she say? What could she do? The man who had saved her life had done so without hesitation, without asking anything of her. And yet, here she was, still holding on to resentment for a reason she could no longer fully explain. She looked away, her eyes focusing on the wall across from her. It was easier to avoid his gaze, easier to pretend that everything was fine, that her beliefs hadn't been challenged in the most profound way. But deep down, Anne knew the truth. Nothing was fine, and nothing would ever be the same again. Dr. Matthews could sense the shift in the room, the quiet tension that hung between them. He had seen it before. People who had never questioned their beliefs were often the hardest to reach. Their ideas were so firmly entrenched in their minds that it took something drastic, a life-or-death situation, to shake them free. But even then, the process was slow, painful, and often met with resistance. He took a step closer to her bed, leaning against the edge. His voice, when it came, was softer than before. "You know, Anne, I didn't save you because of who you are or what you believe. I saved you because I took an oath. My job, my responsibility is to heal, and it doesn't matter what you think of me or of anyone else. My duty is to save lives." Anne remained silent, her eyes still fixed on the wall. She wasn't ready to admit it, not yet. But something inside her shifted. She couldn't quite place it, but it was there, like a tiny crack in the armor she had spent years building around herself. Dr. Matthews didn't push further. He understood that change didn't happen overnight. It took time and patience and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. He had done his part. The rest Anne would have to figure out on her own. And maybe, just maybe, someday she would see the world a little differently. The door clicked shut softly behind him as he left the room, leaving Anne alone with her thoughts. The stillness that followed was heavy. She could still hear the echoes of his words in her mind, like a mantra she couldn't escape.
"I saved you because it was my duty. It wasn't about race."
It wasn't about anything other than the simple, undeniable truth that Dr. Matthews had done his job, and he had done it well. Anne's mind whirred. It was hard to think clearly, hard to reconcile what she had known with what she was learning now, but there was no denying it. Her anger, her prejudice were starting to feel less like convictions and more like barriers that she had built, not for protection, but for isolation. And now those barriers were starting to crack. She didn't know how long she lay there staring at the ceiling, lost in her thoughts, but when she finally closed her eyes, the bitterness that had once consumed her didn't feel quite as sharp. There was still a long way to go, and she knew it. But for the first time in days, she felt something else, something that had been missing for so long. Hope. Anne's recovery was progressing, but it felt to her as though every step forward was accompanied by a series of internal battles. Her body was mending itself stitch by stitch, but her heart, Her mind felt far more fractured than she could ever have imagined. For so long, Anne had lived within the comfort of her beliefs, standing on the foundations of what she had been taught. Those beliefs had shielded her from the uncomfortable truths about herself and the world around her. But now, lying in this sterile hospital room, she could feel those walls beginning to crack. The anger that had initially consumed her, the sharp words she had thrown at Dr. Matthews seemed less justified now. She didn't know exactly when it started, but somewhere between the hours of silence and the conversations she had overheard from the nurses, something had begun to shift within her. It was small, almost imperceptible at first, like a faint echo in the back of her mind. The change was slow, and Anne wasn't yet ready to confront it. She wasn't ready to let go of the familiar comfort of her anger, the pride that had built up for years, keeping her in a world where she felt she understood everything. But there was no denying it, something was different. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't silence the voice inside her that said, "Maybe you were wrong." The nights in the hospital were the hardest. During the day, she could keep herself occupied, pretending that everything was as it had always been. But when the lights dimmed, when the noise from the outside world faded, her thoughts crept in, uninvited and relentless. It was in the quiet hours that she allowed herself to think, even if only for a few moments. She found herself questioning the things she had once taken for granted, the things she had been so certain of, so sure were right. And it wasn't just about Dr. Matthews. No, it was bigger than that. It was about the very fabric of who she had believed herself to be. She had been raised in a world where race defined everything, where every interaction, every relationship, was colored by the color of someone's skin. She had been taught to fear what was different, to look down upon those who didn't fit the mold she had been shown. Her world had been divided into neat little boxes, boxes that kept her comfortable, kept her in control. But now, after what had happened to her, after seeing Dr. Matthews, a black man, as someone who had not only saved her life but treated her with more respect and care than many others, Anne felt as though those boxes were slowly crumbling away. She had never questioned the status quo before. The world had always made sense to her in a way. People were born into certain roles, and their skin color defined who they were, what they were capable of. She had never seen beyond that. But now, in the aftermath of her life being saved, she was forced to look at herself, forced to see that her previous beliefs had never been about truth or justice. They had been about control, about keeping others at a distance so that she could feel safe, so she could feel superior. But now Anne felt the weight of her own ignorance pressing down on her. Dr. Matthews had treated her not as a racist or a prejudiced woman, but as a person in need of care. He hadn't seen her as a threat. He hadn't judged her for her anger.
He had simply done his job.
And in doing so, he had exposed the deepest parts of Anne's soul, the parts she had spent a lifetime hiding from. He had shown her the possibility of a world where people didn't judge each other based on the color of their skin. He had shown her that there was more to a person than the box they had been placed in. But that didn't make the change easy. There were days when Anne woke up and thought, "I can't keep doing this." There were days when the weight of what she had come to understand seemed too much to bear. How could she have spent so much of her life thinking the way she did? How could she have treated others with so much disdain, with so much arrogance? The guilt was suffocating. But then there were other days when Anne felt something else, something like relief. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and for the first time, she could see the world with new eyes. But even then, the old habits, the old beliefs crept back in. They whispered in her ear, reminding her of the world she used to know, the world she had been so sure of. She found herself sitting up late one night, staring out the small window of her hospital room. The moonlight spilled across the floor, casting long shadows against the walls. Anne wasn't sure what she was looking for. She wasn't even sure what she was feeling. But as the quiet of the night pressed in around her, she felt a yearning to do something she hadn't done in years. Reflect. Truly reflect. To think about the person she had been, the person she had become, and the person she still could be. It was in these moments of quiet contemplation that Anne found herself confronting the very heart of her anger. She wasn't angry at Dr. Matthews anymore, not really. She was angry at herself. She was angry because she had spent so much of her life holding on to something that had never been right, never been true. She had judged an entire group of people based on nothing more than their skin color. And in doing so, she had closed herself off from so much of what life had to offer. It was a slow, Painful realization, and it didn't come all at once. But every day as Anne looked deeper within herself, the walls she had built up began to crumble one brick at a time. She had spent years building those walls, and now it was time to tear them down. But how? How could she undo a lifetime of ingrained hatred, of learned prejudice? The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't something that could be done in a day or even a week. It was a process, a long, grueling process of undoing the damage that had been done to her soul. But Anne knew that the first step was to admit to herself that she had been wrong. To admit that the world she had believed in was flawed, that her beliefs had been based on fear, not truth. And she wasn't sure how to do that yet. She wasn't sure how to face the people she had hurt, how to confront the damage she had done, but she knew it had to start somewhere. And maybe, just maybe, it could start with Dr. Matthews. When he came into her room the next morning, it was with the same calm demeanor, the same professionalism that he had shown her throughout her recovery. He didn't look at her with judgment, didn't treat her any differently than he had before. It was as though her outbursts, her anger, hadn't happened at all. He simply came in, checked her vitals, and made sure she was comfortable. Anne looked up at him, her heart racing. She wanted to speak, wanted to tell him something, but the words felt stuck in her throat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she managed to say something. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. It wasn't just for saving her life. It was for giving her the chance to see things differently, for offering her the opportunity to change. Dr. Matthews looked at her for a moment, then smiled. It wasn't a smug smile or a knowing one. It was simply a smile of understanding. He nodded as if to say, "You're welcome," before moving on to his next task. But for Anne, that moment marked something profound. It was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter that would take time to write, but one she was ready to begin. Anne couldn't remember the last time she had felt so uncertain. The days since her surgery had started to blur together, each one marked by a steady rhythm of hospital visits, medical checkups, and endless hours spent alone with her thoughts. Her recovery, both physical and mental, felt endless, like a road that stretched out far beyond what she could see. The pain from her injuries had mostly faded, but the emotional scars, the ones left by her own mind, were still there, festering quietly beneath the surface. Each time Dr. Matthews entered her room, she noticed something different. He wasn't just the doctor who had saved her life anymore. She had begun to see him as something more, a symbol of the change that was now underway in her own mind. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everything he represented, a person who had never once let her prejudice stand in the way of doing his job, a person who had seen her in all her flaws, in all her anger, and still treated her with the same level of care and professionalism he would any other patient. In the beginning, Anne had thought his calm demeanor was a form of weakness. She had assumed that, like many others, he would try to placate her, to apologize for being the very thing she hated. But he didn't. He simply did his job, and he did it well. And that in itself made Anne question everything she had once believed about herself and the world. She hadn't expected this kind of self-reflection. She hadn't expected him to be the mirror that reflected the ugliness she had spent a lifetime denying. She spent more time alone now than she ever had before. The nurses were kind and always checked in, but her interactions with them felt superficial in comparison to the whirlwind of thoughts swirling in her head. She had learned something new about herself, something she wasn't ready to admit but couldn't ignore anymore. She had been wrong. All her life, she had clung to a belief that her race somehow made her more important, more deserving of certain privileges, of certain treatment. She had believed that the color of her skin placed her above others, and that those who were different from her were less than. But now she could feel the weight of her own ignorance, suffocating her in a way that felt more real than any physical pain she had ever known. Every day, the anger that had once consumed her seemed to grow quieter. It wasn't gone, not yet, but it wasn't as loud either. It was a background noise now, one she could hear but no longer heed. It was in the moments when she sat alone, staring out the small window of her hospital room, that she began to see the change. It was in the quietness of those moments that she found herself wondering about the stories of the people who had crossed her path. People like Dr. Matthews, who didn't need to prove anything, who had no need to justify their existence with their skin color or their background. They were just human beings trying to make the world a better place in the only way they knew how. And Anne had been too blind to see it. It wasn't easy. It never was. She had spent decades living in a world that had told her race mattered more than anything else. She had been raised in a place where hate was taught, where people were seen as lesser because of something they couldn't control. But Anne had been given a second chance. Her life, her actual life, had been saved by the very person she had once considered unworthy. And as she sat in that hospital room, the reality of it all slowly began to sink in.
It wasn't just about the color of someone's skin. It was about who they were as a person.
It was about kindness. It was about empathy. It was about the simple human act of caring for someone else even when you didn't owe them anything. But how could she make up for the years of hatred she had carried? How could she undo the damage she had done to herself and to the people around her? She hadn't just rejected others because of their race. She had rejected kindness, compassion, and the belief that every person had something valuable to offer. She had spent so much time erecting walls around her heart that she had forgotten how to truly connect with others. But Dr. Matthews had shown her the way. He had shown her that true strength lay not in refusing to accept others, but in offering your heart and your hands to those who needed it the most. It was these thoughts that plagued her as the days wore on. She couldn't sleep at night, couldn't shake the feeling that she had wasted so much time, so much potential, and what was worse was that she was aware of her own complicity. She hadn't just accepted the hatred around her, she had fostered it. She had let it grow and fester within herself, as if it were a part of her, something that had become too ingrained to remove. But every day, the urge to change grew stronger. It was as if the universe had given her this moment, this opportunity to undo the damage she had done. And with each passing moment, she felt herself being pulled towards something bigger than herself, something that didn't care about the color of her skin, something that was just about being human. She thought about the people she had wronged, the people she had dismissed or hurt without ever realizing it. She thought about the way she had treated others, the way she had spoken, and the way her words had cut deep into the hearts of those who didn't deserve it. Her life had been a shield, a defense mechanism designed to keep her from truly connecting with others, to keep her safe in her own self-imposed world. But now that shield felt heavier than ever, and she could no longer bear the weight of it. And so, one day, she made a decision. A decision she hadn't thought she would ever make. She asked for Dr. Matthews. It wasn't easy. She had rehearsed the words in her head 100 times over, trying to find the right way to say them, to express the thoughts that had been swirling in her mind for so long. But when he walked into the room, his familiar calm presence filling the space, she simply blurted it out. "I was wrong," Anne said, her voice shaking. "I was so wrong, Dr. Matthews. All my life I've thought that the color of my skin made me better than others. But I can see now that I was blinded by my own ignorance. You saved my life, and I owe you more than just gratitude. I owe you an apology for the things I've said, for the things I've believed. I've spent so much time hating people like you, without ever seeing the person you really are." Dr. Matthews didn't respond right away. He simply looked at her with the same calmness he always had. And in that moment, Anne realized that this was what true grace looked like. He wasn't waiting for an apology. He wasn't expecting her to change in some dramatic way. He had already done his part. He had saved her life, and in doing so, he had given her the gift of a second chance. It was up to her what she did with that gift. "I don't expect anything from you, Anne," he finally said. "All I want is for you to heal. I've done my part. Now it's up to you to find your way forward." And that was all Anne needed. In that moment, she knew that change wasn't just about one act of kindness or one grand gesture. It was about taking responsibility for who you were and being willing to take the first steps toward being better. It was about owning your mistakes, accepting your flaws, and then moving forward with the knowledge that growth was possible, even for someone like her. The healing wasn't instant. Anne knew that. It was a slow process, a journey that would take time, but for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know what the future held. But she knew one thing for sure. The walls she had built around her heart were starting to come down, and maybe, just maybe, she could learn to build a better world for herself, one brick at a time. The world outside Anne's hospital room seemed distant now, a blur of sounds and colors she had once been intimately familiar with, but had now become disconnected from. The days that had passed since her apology to Dr. Matthews felt like an eternity, and yet, they also felt like the beginning of something new. A new chapter, one she had never expected to write. It wasn't an easy process, not by any means. but every step forward brought her a little closer to understanding what it meant to truly change. Anne spent her days in the sterile white walls of the hospital, the rhythmic beeping of the machines a constant background noise to the inner turmoil that churned inside her. The apology she had given Dr. Matthews had been liberating, but it had also left her with an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Saying the words had been one thing. Believing them, understanding them, and living by them, well, that was an entirely different matter. She had seen Dr. Matthews only a few times since that conversation, each time feeling the weight of his presence and the unspoken understanding between them. He hadn't said much in response to her words except that it was up to her to find her way. She had respected that, respected his distance because deep down she knew it was the right thing to do. Dr. Matthews had done his part. He had saved her life. Now, the burden of change rested solely on Anne's shoulders. In the stillness of the hospital room, Anne found herself confronting a very uncomfortable truth. She had to face the world she had once known, the world that had shaped her beliefs, and the people who had been complicit in her hatred. She had always lived in a bubble, surrounded by others who shared her views, who validated her ignorance. Now the idea of facing those people, of confronting the legacy of her past actions, filled her with dread. She couldn't ignore the fact that the hurt she had caused went far beyond her interactions with Dr. Matthews. Her life had been a series of small, quiet actions, each one reinforcing the belief that certain people were beneath her. It wasn't just in the grand gestures or the loud moments of hate. It was in the subtle ways she had treated people, dismissively, condescendingly, without ever truly seeing them for who they were. And the guilt that accompanied these realizations was almost suffocating. But Anne had promised herself that she would change. And part of that change meant going back, confronting her past and making amends. She knew she couldn't undo the damage, couldn't erase the hurt she had caused, but she had to try. She had to begin the process of healing, not just for herself, but for the people she had wronged. The thought of facing her family was the hardest. Anne had grown up in a home where racist jokes were the norm, where divisive language was casually thrown around as if it were harmless. Her parents, who had always been proud of their so-called traditional values, had never once questioned their own prejudices. For them, the world was black and white, and anyone who didn't fit into their narrow definition of what was acceptable was simply ignored or dismissed. Anne had spent years absorbing these views, even when they didn't sit right with her. She had never dared to challenge them because it was easier to go along with the crowd, easier to remain in her comfort zone. But now, as Anne lay in that hospital bed, she could no longer pretend that everything was okay. She could no longer ignore the damage she had done by perpetuating those views. By choosing to align herself with people who refused to see others as equals, she had to confront them. It wasn't an easy decision. Anne had spent years distancing herself from uncomfortable truths, burying her doubts beneath layers of denial. But as the days wore on, the weight of those unresolved feelings grew heavier, and she knew that she couldn't move forward until she had faced the people who had helped shape her into the person she had become. So, she made a choice. She called her parents. The phone call was awkward at first. The words felt strange in her mouth, as if they didn't belong to her, as if she was playing a part in a play she hadn't rehearsed. She had no idea what she was going to say, only that she had to say something. Her heart was racing as she dialed the number, her hands shaking slightly with the anticipation of what was to come. She had no idea how they would react, what they would think, but she knew she couldn't hold back anymore. "Hello?" Her mother's voice came through the line, sharp and cold as it always was. "Mom, it's Anne," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I need to talk to you about something important." There was a pause on the other end, a long silence that seemed to stretch for miles. Anne could hear her mother shifting on the other end, probably adjusting the phone to her ear, unsure of what was coming next. Finally, her mother spoke. "Is everything all right? You sound different." Anne swallowed hard, trying to gather her thoughts. She had never been good at having difficult conversations, but this time she didn't want to shy away. "No, everything's not all right. I've been thinking a lot, and I need to tell you something." Another pause, longer this time. Anne could almost hear her mother's brain working overtime, trying to anticipate what was coming. "I've been wrong," Anne said, the words coming out in a rush. "All these years I've believed things I shouldn't have believed. I've hurt people and I didn't even realize it. I've lived my whole life thinking that People who are different from me don't matter. And I've been wrong, Mom. I've been wrong about so many things. Her mother's voice came through the phone again, this time with a touch of disbelief. What are you talking about? What do you mean wrong? We've always taught you what's right. Anne could hear the defensive tone in her mother's voice, and it hurt more than she had anticipated. This was the moment she had feared. The moment when the walls she had built up, the walls of comfort and safety, would come crashing down. But she couldn't stop now. She couldn't go back. I've been racist, Mom. I've been racist, and I didn't even see it. All these years I've let people's skin color define who they are. I've let my own ignorance guide my actions. And I can't do that anymore. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the things I've said, the things I've believed. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. For a moment, Anne thought her mother had hung up or that she was so stunned she couldn't speak. But then her mother spoke again, her voice softer now, though still filled with confusion. Anne, I don't know what's happened to you, but this isn't how we were raised. Anne could feel her chest tightening, her throat constricting. This wasn't how she had imagined the conversation going. She had hoped for understanding, for acknowledgement of the fact that she was trying to change, but it was clear that her parents weren't ready to meet her halfway. Not yet. I know it's hard, Anne said, her voice breaking slightly. But I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending that the way I've thought, the way I've lived is okay. It's not. And I know it's not going to be easy, but I need to start somewhere. Her mother didn't respond for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was filled with a mixture of uncertainty and disbelief. I don't know if I can understand this, Anne. But if you think you need to change, then I guess I'll have to respect that. The conversation ended shortly after that. Anne sat in the silence of her room, the weight of her words settling in. She had expected rejection, had anticipated the confusion and the resistance. But still she couldn't help feeling a pang of sadness. She had hoped for more, for the possibility that her parents might see things differently. But change was never easy, and sometimes it took time for people to understand what they weren't ready to see. Anne knew she wasn't done yet. This was just the first step. There were more conversations to have, more relationships to mend, but in that moment she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and uncomfortable truths. But for the first time, Anne was ready to face it. Days turned into weeks, and Anne's stay in the hospital extended beyond what she had initially expected. The walls of the sterile room, once a comforting cocoon from the world she had always known, were now closing in on her. She could no longer escape the reality of what she was becoming, or perhaps more accurately, what she had always been. Every inch of her body, every moment spent in quiet reflection, continued to remind her of the life she had lived, the ways she had hurt others without ever realizing the weight of her actions. But now every fiber of her being was aching to correct those wrongs, to change in ways that weren't just words or empty promises. Anne could feel the shift within herself, even if it wasn't visible to anyone else. It wasn't something she could touch or hold, but it was there, an internal unraveling, a shedding of the person she used to be. It was an uncomfortable transformation, one that left her unsettled in ways she hadn't expected. But it was also liberating. With each passing day, the remnants of the old Anne, the one who clung to outdated ideas and prejudices, began to fade into the background. But there were still so many questions. Anne knew she couldn't move forward without first confronting the full extent of her past. The phone call with her mother had been a start, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to simply acknowledge her mistakes. She needed to look at her life as a whole, at the relationships she had damaged, the people she had hurt, and the small, insidious ways her actions had contributed to the very systems of division that had shaped her worldview. There was no easy way to do this. There was no handbook, no step-by-step guide on how to dismantle a lifetime of ingrained bias. But the more Anne sat with the uncomfortable truth of her past, the more she realized that it was a process of constant, uncomfortable self-examination. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about finding all the answers. It was about starting somewhere, acknowledging the pain, the ignorance, the harm, and then using that awareness to fuel change. It wasn't enough to say the words. Apologies were meaningless without action. She knew that. She had to show the world that she was capable of more, that she could be someone different from the person she had been. But the first step, the hardest part, was allowing herself to feel the full weight of her own accountability. One afternoon, as she lay in her hospital bed staring out the window, Anne made a decision. She was going to reach out to the people she had wronged, friends, acquaintances, people from her past who had either been hurt by her actions or, worse, had been complicit in the same prejudices she had carried. It was terrifying. She wasn't sure what to expect, what kind of reception she would get, or even if they would be open to hearing her. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that she had to try. Picking up the phone, Anne dialed the number of her old friend Claire, someone she had known since childhood. Claire had always been the kind of person who had been kind to everyone, who saw the best in people. Anne had never understood that about her, always dismissing her belief in kindness as naive. But now, as Anne pressed the phone to her ear, she realized how much she had missed that simple, unwavering quality in Claire. It rang twice before Claire picked up. "Hello? Claire, it's Anne," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I know it's been a long time, but I need to talk to you." There was a brief pause before Claire responded. "Anne? Wow, it's been years. Is everything okay?" Anne took a deep breath, steeling herself. This was the moment. "No, everything's not okay. I've been thinking a lot, and I owe you an apology. I owe a lot of people apologies. I've been wrong, Claire. I've been wrong about so many things." Claire's voice softened, and Anne could hear the surprise in her tone. "What are you talking about? You've always been the way you've been, you know." "I know, and that's what's wrong," Anne said, her voice tight with emotion. "I've been racist, Claire. I've spent my life thinking that people who didn't look like me weren't as good as I was. I've hurt people with my words, with my actions, and I didn't even realize it. I've been blind and I've been selfish, but I see now that I was wrong. I was so wrong." There was a long pause on the other end of the phone, and Anne's heart sank. She had expected silence, but hearing it made the reality of the situation more raw than she had imagined. She hadn't expected forgiveness. But still, the weight of the silence seemed to fill the room. "Anne, I don't know what to say," Claire finally responded. "That's a lot to process." "I know," Anne said, her voice shaking. "And I don't expect you to just forgive me. I don't expect anything, but I need you to know that I see it now. I've spent my whole life clinging to these views, and I've hurt people, including you. I can't take back the things I've done, but I'm trying to change. I'm trying to be better. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all the harm I've caused." Claire sighed. I don't know if I can just forgive you like that. I don't know if I even fully understand what you're saying, but I appreciate you saying this, Anne. I really do." Anne's heart felt heavy with the weight of Claire's response, but there was a sense of relief too. She hadn't expected a magical resolution, but this was a beginning. A recognition of her mistakes, a step toward owning up to the damage she had done. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but it was progress. "I don't expect forgiveness, Claire, but I needed to tell you. I needed you to know how sorry I am," Anne said quietly. There was a long pause before Claire spoke again. "Well, I'm glad you called, Anne. I'm glad you're starting to see things differently. I really hope you do change for your own sake, and maybe for the sake of the people you've hurt." Anne nodded, even though Claire couldn't see her. "I will, I promise. Thank you for listening." The conversation ended soon after that, and Anne sat in the silence of her room reflecting on the weight of the exchange. It wasn't the closure she had hoped for, but it was something. It was the first step in a long journey that had no clear end. A road that would require honesty, vulnerability, and most of all, a willingness to admit her flaws and face the consequences of her actions. As Anne sat there, she realized something else. Change wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about fixing what was broken in her own life. It was about understanding the broader impact of her actions, and how every step she took toward healing would affect not just her own future, but the future of those around her. The journey wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be painless, but it was hers to make, and that for the first time in her life felt like enough.